All right, students, so it's week 3. We're getting into chapters 5 for this week and then chapter 6 next week. So for chapter 5 this week, we're talking about the cognitive development during infancy and toddlerhood. Now, the two key theorists, actually there's 3, but for right now we're going to talk about 2. I'll talk about the third one briefly at the end. But what I really want you to know is Piaget's theory, the cognitive theory. Now, if you remember, the premise of Piaget's theory was that we learn cognitively, we are learning by manipulating the world around us. Okay? And so when we think of like an infant, right, what does an infant like to do? Well, they like to grab things, they like to stare at things, they like to put things in their mouth, right? They use their reflexes to manipulate the world around them, whether it's, grasping at things or kicking at things, right? And then eventually they start to crawl, and, as they reach a certain stage, they start to become more mobile, and, they start doing other things like throwing stuff or sitting in their high chair and dumping things off the end of the table or the end of the high chair table, right? So what they're doing is they're trying to learn about their world, and they're doing it by manipulating the things that are around them and using their senses, because their senses and their reflexes are very key to manipulating their world, okay? So in the first stage, which is called the sensory motor stage, which is the infancy and toddlerhood, or reaching the age of 2 roughly, getting up there, it's broken down into different sub-stages. All right, so in the first substage, it's the circular reaction. And the circular reaction is when the child just uses their naturally born reflexes to interact with their world, right? So imagine the child laying on their back and they have like a mobile above them with their toys hanging. What do? Well, they're kind of throwing their arms around and throwing their legs around. And let's say they hit one of those toys just on accident. They weren't intentionally trying to do it. They just hit the toy. Well, that's their natural reflex, right? Circular reaction, also primary circular reaction. That's the same as well. So they're stumbling into the experience, and then in the primary circular reaction, they're trying to actually recreate that experience somehow, right? So they're trying to create or gain voluntary control over what they're doing, right? So now they're trying to hit that toy because they saw that when they hit it, it moves. So now they're trying. Now they're not the greatest with it because they don't have the best accuracy, so it takes them a while to do it again. And when they hit the toy again, they just sit there and stare at the toy, right? If you've ever watched a child, they'll stare at the swinging part of the mobile, right? And they just stop and they stare, right? You've probably seen this with an infant. Then that's 1 to 4 months. And then 4 to 8 months is the secondary circular reaction, which is now they've gained better control, better motor control, so they have better accuracy and they can do more things, right? They can move more things, they can touch more things, they can grab more things, okay? And that's 4 to 8 months. And then there's the coordination part of it. This is where the child is actually developing a thought process where they're like, well, what if I do this, or what if I do that, or what if I do this, right? Like, how can I do this? So they have a goal-oriented mindset now, where they're trying to do certain things to see what happens, and that's 8 to 12 months. Now, back to the 4 to 8 months during the secondary circular reaction. Towards the end of that, we start to actually see more object permanence. Going into coordination, we start to see that the child is gaining the idea, okay, that things exist when they're not in sight, okay? And that's what object permanence is. So object permanence is this notion that when a child doesn't see something, they think it doesn't exist. Okay? You can watch the video through the PowerPoint to gain a better understanding of what object permanence is. Okay, and then when the child actually overcomes object permanence, then the child is able to understand that things exist when they are no longer in sight. You know, it's said that dogs are as smart as a toddler. Okay, they have the learning capacities of up to a toddler. And if you have a dog, sometimes your dog might hide its head, right? Like it can't see you. And even though its body's sticking out, it's hiding its head, right? And so it can't see you, and it thinks that you can't see them. That's kind of a form of object permanence, okay? Now, tertiary circular reactions, now the child is just pushing things even further. They're adding more to their coordinated secondary circular reaction. You know, they're doing things like maybe they're like, hey, what's going to happen if I push this toy down the stairs, right? And then they just want to watch and observe and take in the information. So they're kind of adding an extra element to the stuff that they were already doing. All of this is creating mental schemas, right, which are mental representations of things as we're learning them, okay? And Piaget believes that as we are manipulating the things around us, we are developing these schemas, we're categorizing them in our head, and that's how we're learning things, okay? Now, let's move on to information processing model. And if you remember, the premise here is that we are these symbol manipulating machines, and we do learn symbols and we retain them in our memory, and that's how we cognitively develop, okay? So what I'm going to cover with information processing model is what's called the 3-stage memory model. This is the most commonly used model to understand how we remember things. Information processing is based on memory, okay? So they're going to use this 3-stage model, all right? And again, it's the one that we use for memory the most. So it has 3 boxes, all right? And so these are our 3 stages of memory. Now on the outside of this, the first thing that has to happen to ignite this memory, okay, is that we have to have these outside experiences, okay? So we call this like, we'll just call this stimuli, okay? So we're going to call it stimuli. All right, so we have this stimulus coming in. All right, usually it's through our senses. And this first box is our sensory memory. We also call it register, okay? And so the first box is our sensory memory. So as we're, taking things in, like right now you're watching me and you're listening to me, so that stimuli is moving into your sensory memory. Now, there's a very quick amount of time for this memory, okay? It's just a few seconds roughly, and if we're not paying attention to things, it drops off, it goes away, okay? We may what's called habituate to it. All right, so we may habituate to, let's say, like the sound of an air conditioner, all right, or a regular constant sound of something. All right, we may habituate to these things. We also call it adapt or adaption. Okay, so like when light changes, our eyes adapt to what's happening in our environment. Okay, so that has to do with our stimuli and our sensory memory. We habituate or we adapt, so it drops off unless we engage in what's called selective attention. So that's selective attention. So selective attention is when we're choosing to pay attention to something. And when we choose to pay attention to it, then it gets moved from our sensory memory to what's called our short-term memory, or we also call it working memory. Okay? So short-term memory or working memory. Now, short-term memory is not how most people use this term. People refer to it as like what happened yesterday or and so on and so on. But really what it is within the last like 15 to 30 seconds. That's roughly what we tend to remember, is like the last 15 to 30 seconds. There are people who have really excellent memories that go beyond this. There are people who have poorer memories that go below this, but this is roughly the average. So when we pay attention to something and it gets into our memory, all right, it usually can stay there for 15 to 30 seconds unless we engage in something. That's why it's called working memory, is because we're working things in our head. We're thinking over things. So like if I gave you 3 words to remember right now and I said hat, dog, ball, right? So remember those 3 words. So working memory is when we're engaging in our thought. We're trying to actually think of things. And one way that we try to keep this alive, keep the thought that we're having alive so it doesn't drop off, is what's called the maintenance rehearsal, okay? Or rehearsal loop is another word for it, right? So we may rehearse things again and again and again in our head, right? We're trying to keep that thought alive, because the longer we keep it alive in our working memory, the better it's going to actually move into our long-term memory, okay? And that's this box, is long-term memory. All right, so if we go back to those 3 words that I asked you to remember, right? I actually don't remember them. I think it was dog, hat, ball, okay? But how did you remember those 3 words? And did you try? And if you tried to remember those 3 words, did you also understand what I was saying at the same time? Or did you concentrate on repeating those 3 words to yourself? Okay? So this is kind of like our memory, right? Like when study habits come in. So the reason why you want to repeat things, the reason why you want to do what's called elaborative rehearsal, where you talk to people about what you're learning, or you try to teach people about what you're learning. It helps move things from our working memory into our long-term memory, so that when we are ready to use it, which is called retrieval, and we pull it out of our long-term memory and we put it back into our working memory, we can use it, like on a test, okay? And so when we move things from working memory to long-term memory, this is called consolidation. Sorry, I don't have enough whiteboard space here in my home, but consolidation is when we're moving information from working memory to long-term memory. And then when we pull it out, it's called retrieval. Okay? And so we retrieve the information. And sometimes we fail to retrieve the information. It may be in there, but we fail to pull it out into our working memory. We need cues to spark that, and so on. Okay? Now, long-term memory, as we know it today, is infinite. There's no capacity, there's no time. You know, the brain starts to deteriorate. Physically, it starts to deteriorate. So then we do start to lose connections, and we lose like certain memories because of that, or the brain doesn't function as well. But from what we understand, things don't really just disappear once they're stored. They pretty much stay there. We just lose the connections to access that part of our brain, okay? So this is the 3-stage memory model. All right, this is the foundation of the information processing model, because it believes without the memory, then we will not be able to fully grasp or store or understand the symbols that we are taking in. And we'll talk more about like how this works with like habituation and inhibition and all this other stuff as we continue on, and how our memory advances and grows, and how we are able to actually retain and keep certain information, like the magical number, which is 7 plus or minus 5. That's our magical number for digits that we can keep in our head. Okay, so from the range of 5 to 9, that's how many digits we can keep in our head at one time. That's how many items we can keep in our working memory. But as a child, that's not the case. All right, that's as we get older, when we reach adolescence, that's when we can actually retain that amount of information. When we're children, we can't do that, okay? But I want you to just understand this premise, this understanding of the three-stage memory model, because that's the foundation of the information processing model. Now, Vygotsky is the third theorist I want you to, or Vygotsky, okay, that I want you to remember. And if you remember, his premise or his idea was that we have these multi-generational interactions from one generation to the next that help us to learn. All right, this can also be from teacher to student, parent to child, grandparent to child, okay? Through these interactions, we learn, we develop, we start to grow, okay? He has this idea that's called the zone of proximal development, which states that on our own, we can only learn so much, and then we need someone else, such as a teacher or a parent, to come in and actually start teaching us these things, all right? But we can only learn so far in advance, okay? That's the zone of proximal development, or we also can call it the optimal development zone, all right? If it's too far advanced for the child, then they're not going to learn. And if it's too close to what the child already knows, it's not challenging enough. So there's this particular zone that we want to be in to help teach the child or help teach the student or whatever, okay? And that's the main thing with Vygotsky, okay, is we want to stretch the individual but not too far, right? But we need to make sure that we're stretching or challenging them. And that's the zone of proximal development. And remember, Vygotsky believed very strongly in the stories that are passed on from generation to generation to generation, right? That's like the main thing, is the stories that we tell, the books that we are reading to the kids, okay? We can see that in today's world, right? The news that people take in, the information that people take in, this is what's, teaching them to think or learn in a certain way, right? So be cautious of what you're reading. Be cautious of what you're learning. Be cautious of certain news outlets that you're taking in, because all of that can manipulate everything that we believe and everything, and in every way that we think, okay? So it's best that you understand that so that you can use your critical thinking skills to kind of sift through and evaluate a lot of that stuff. But back to Vygotsky, okay? So that's the third theorist. So we got Piaget, cognitive development, information processing model, cognitive development, and Vygotsky, also cognitive development. So have a great week. And again, if you have any questions, please send me a message through Canvas or email me.